going to ask Cheryl to bring up our first image. If we can do that. Okay. And there's so many different people that we could talk about. But I'm going to zero in particular on 6 artists, 6 photographers. And I guarantee you, you may not know their names, but you probably know the images and think, oh, I've seen that. Photography, of course, is invented in 1839. The first photographs are daguerreotypes. And at first, photography was seen as, actually one of the phrases to describe it was a magic pencil or a pencil of nature. And the idea was, isn't this miraculous that you can capture, again, the intricacies of something, again, like a fern? And that was really, again, the kind of driving force at the very, very beginning. Now, it wasn't long before photographers saw that these photographs could be evidence and could have a different agenda. So I'm going to have you go to the next one, please, Cheryl. This is the very first, let's see. It's not wanting to, maybe it will.
Well, is this the same show that you did yesterday at Lifelong?
It is, Tom. So you don't have to worry about this one, or you could give it. You could give it.
No, I don't think I can give it. I think I can sneak a nap in between now and my next
I could take a nap and you could give this one. Yeah, yeah.
Who it is?
Yeah. So
It was great, by the way. For those of you who didn't see it yesterday, it's really good.
Thank you. Thank you. So photography is soon seen as a way to collect evidence. Again, not just this miraculous way to capture the intricacies of a fern, but a way to, again, achieve a different agenda. This is the very first, or thought to be the very first image of slavery in the United States that was ever recorded. Lewis Hine, whose work that we're going to look at shortly, said it best. And I love this quote. He said, photography exists to show things that need to be appreciated and show things that need to be changed. And even stronger, this is another photographer we'll look at today, Charles Moore, who was a great documentarian of the civil rights movement. He said, I don't want to fight with my fists. I want to fight with my camera. I would rather have the camera be my weapon than my fists any day. And I thought, isn't that a terrific quote? There are dozens and dozens of photographers that you could use to illustrate this point. But for our purposes, going to focus just on 6. Going to look at Jacob Riis and Lewis Hine and Marion Post Walcott and Gordon Parks, Charles Moore, and J.R. And I guarantee you, again, you may or may not know the names, but I bet you will know many of the images. Next image, please. Jacob Riis was an immigrant from Denmark, and he was actually a police reporter / journalist / reformer. And he never, ever would have thought that photography was an art form, because to him, well, it just wasn't. His photos were absolutely mesmerizing, but you got to remember, he was not thinking like an artist. Furthest thing from his mind. He was not thinking about darkroom technique or composition or light or line. This existed for him as a tool to collect evidence. And his only real goal was to show that what he was writing about was true and say, here, look at this. Next image, please. While working as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, he did a series of exposés on slum conditions in the Lower East Side. And again, clearly he saw that the written accounts couldn't truly express what he was seeing. So he adds photography and again, completely transforms his reporting. He goes absolutely everywhere, and often with what were called the sanitary police. And remember that Theodore Roosevelt was an early force in that world of exploring these conditions. Riis went to crowded tenements and docksides and cheap lodging houses and sweatshops and cellar beer dives as well, and captures a lot of what he sees in a book called How the Other Half Lives. He had to work very, very quickly. And remember at that time, he's got kind of cumbersome equipment and this magnesium flash powder. So all of this, I can't imagine hauling this equipment and taking the photographs. But when you look at them, look at this piece. This is called Bandit's Roost. And this was the nickname for a little alley near Mulberry Street in New York City. And if you look at it, again, it's technically kind of crude, right? It's blurred, it's overexposed. It's got a kind of a peculiar perspective and a composition that's not really balanced. But look at it again. It works, and it works powerfully. I think what it really has is the power of witness. Next image, please. This one is simply called 5 cents a spot. And this again captures a lodging house. If you look at this in the next room, it housed 15 men and women and a baby. And again, just enough space for you to lay down for the night, sleep with your blanket, and that was it. And again, the conditions were horrifying, and he wanted to show you the reality of the time. Next image, please. This one is lodgers in Bayard Street. And again, took many, many photographs of families at work. And these families were often in fairly small rooms, often didn't have much in terms of light and air, often working 12 hours or more a day, dawn to 9 p.m., making something, might be making garments, might be making paper flowers, or here, I don't know if you can see what this family is doing, the wooden form that is on the table in front of the couple, they're making cigars. And here, 4,000 a week would have been created. You were paid $15 for 4,000 cigars, and the rent was $12. What Riis really captures hadn't been seen before in photography. This sense of the kind of the chaos of living and working in poverty is captured by Jacob Riis in a way that no one had really ever done before. Next image, please. Louis Hine, kind of the natural continuation in many ways of Riis's work, although he does think about the formal components. And he definitely thinks of himself as a photographer and a person who does what he calls interpretive photography. He was very much ahead of his time. And again, this is Hine here with his camera. He was a young reformer and a young teacher, taught at the New York Ethical Culture School. And again, very, very progressive institution, speakers, the likes of Booker T. Washington and Jane Addams. And he sent his students into the street with cameras as early as 1901 in order, he said, to learn to simply see better and see the world around them. One of Hine's first big projects was documenting immigrants coming through Ellis Island. Next image, please. And I can't even imagine these, if you haven't seen these, Google these because they're absolutely fascinating and quite haunting. And think about the idea that at a time when many cartoonists, of course, are depicting immigrants with horrific, cruel stereotypes, and immigration was then and now politically charged. Hine is depicting immigrants with a sense of dignity and sympathy. And I can't imagine, too, think about what he was doing. Somebody is getting off the boat after an incredibly long, exhausting journey, probably doesn't speak English, and here's a man with his equipment and his flash powder, somehow miming to them that he wants to take the photographs. And he does, and he's successful in this. So this is, again, an incredible and a haunting series. Next image, please. That, again, if you don't know it, Google this, because it is just absolutely so powerful and so fascinating. But you probably know Hine for some of his most famous work, and that is work commissioned by the National Child Labor Committee. And I'm going to ask for the next image, please. And I bet many of you have seen these images. What Hine did here was to misrepresent himself in every way possible to get into factories and mills and mines. He had a number of different tricks up his sleeve, and I cannot believe that they worked, but indeed they did. He often posed as an insurance agent saying, well, I really need to inspect this mine, this mill, this plant, and that worked. Now, I don't know why an insurance agent would be toting photo equipment, but again, it worked. He sometimes posed as a postcard seller. Sometimes he said he was a Bible salesman. And often, and this does seem the best of the ruses, he said he was an industrial photographer who needed to look at the equipment and document that. But he tried all these things, and believe it or not, they all really worked. He knew he also couldn't really stop and ask a child anything. He needed to capture the moment. And his thought this was fascinating too. He would try to kind of estimate a child's age based on the buttons on his jacket and where that child stood next to his jacket buttons. And he'd get a little bit of a sense of the age, because obviously he could not stop and interview a child. He needed to capture the evidence. But these are, again, very, very powerful images. This girl here in a textile mill, just extraordinary. Next image, please. And this too, the reality, I think, again, that photographic evidence, the reality of kids working, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, obviously no school, and in very dangerous conditions. You look here and this is in glassworks. Obviously there's no safety goggles. There's no heavy gloves. There's nothing. And here's the kicker, the title to this, and these are a little bit younger, but I'm guessing, 12, 13-year-olds. The title is Midnight in the Glassworks. So again, just giving you some sense of the lives of these kids. And again, this is a huge, huge change was wrought by these photographs. Next image, please. These are breaker boys. Young boys, maybe 8 to 12 years old, but sometimes if you had the right paperwork, you could start as young as 5 or 6-year-olds, worked in mines, many set by chutes of coal. And those chutes would pour down and you would sit on a little bench near that chute and pull out the impurities. So you would be looking to pull out a piece of slate from that stream of coal. And of course, they did have gloves, but this is very, very dangerous, very difficult work. And again, it looks like I don't think you have much to prevent you from breathing in the coal dust, but perhaps a little neckerchief that looks like it might be around the neck. And again, some of these you can see do have gloves as well. But it's just extraordinary to think of what it would have been like to live these lives. I think you'll also notice in looking at these images of young kids that the faces look old before their time. There is a kind of a maturity and a weight and a heaviness to these kids at work that is really, really apparent. Next image, please. And this one too, very haunting. This is a shrimp picker. And again, this is a 5-year-old who was working in this the field of picking shrimp. What's fascinating, I think, for both Rees and Heim is that charts and graphs and tables and firsthand accounts, they tell a story, but they don't quite tell a story as a photograph tells a story. And I think both of these photographers really prove that. Next image, please. Now here's someone you may not know. I don't know if anybody has heard of Marion Post Walcott. I am guessing many people know Margaret Bourke White, who was a contemporary of Marion Post Walcott, but I bet you don't know her. She was educated at the New York School for Social Research and at the University of Vienna. Again, like Heine, a real progressive with the heart of a reformer. She was a freelancer for Life and Fortune, staff photographer for the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, and then worked with the Farm Security Administration from 38 to 42. But when she stopped to get married and have a family, she stopped her career. So we don't have a huge body of work, but what's here is really absolutely powerful and fascinating. And I think for me, because we don't see her photography as much, it's even, I think, kind of newer and fresher than seeing Dorothea Lange's wonderful Migrant Mother again and again. Marion Post Walcott did something quite unusual too in her work in the late 30s. She traveled by herself thousands of miles across the country. She stopped at farms and juke joints, and she stopped at bars and schools and theaters and stores, and talked to people and documented exactly what she saw. First, or the next image, please. I think this is one of my favorites. And again, this is driving across the South, and just such a simple and powerful photograph of the segregated entrance to a movie theater in the South, and just one figure in this whole composition, just one figure of this Black man walking up this back staircase to the entrance to the movie theater, and that very, very simple little arrow pointing up to the segregated admission. And just that sense of starkness, the facility with contrast, the shadows, and just how very, very simple it is, but how very powerful a document it is as well. Next image, please. It's another Marion Post Walcott, just a woman on her porch. Again, we see so many of the works of people like Walker Evans, and I don't think you see as much of a figure like Marion Post Walcott. She depended on creating a relationship. And I think you can really see it in this piece too, of stopping, of talking with people, of befriending them, and creating a connection that would allow for a sense of trust that would have a photograph like this taken. And this woman, again, you can see kind of leaning out from her cabin with a kind of a thin, almost looks like a flour sack dress. And again, just a kind of hollowed eyes, but engaging with the photographer as well. And again, Marion Post Walcott, if you don't know her, Google her. Next image, please. This is another one of hers. Again, very, very simple, but a really powerful image of this, stark, devastated landscape. But then these two children coming towards us who obviously are victims of malnutrition and probably, I assume, rickets. There's something about these, again, I think they're not images that we have seen a lot of. Next image, please. I do not know if very many of you are familiar with the work of Gordon Parks. Yeah, Barbara Nasanchuk is nodding yes, and that delights me. He is a really fascinating character, and you may know his photography. You may not know that he is just one of the most versatile artists really of the 20th century. He was not just a photographer, but he was also a writer. I don't know if very many of you have read his books. He wrote multiple memoirs, including Learning Tree and Choice of Weapons. He was a poet. He wrote quite a few volumes of poetry. He was a musical composer as well. He was a collaborator. He worked with his friend Ralph Ellison on a series of photographs that interpreted the Invisible Man. And he was a filmmaker. Shaft, you may or may not know the original Shaft. He directed that. So he was the first Black photographer with the Farm Security Administration, the first Black photographer at Life magazine, and the first African-American to ever direct a Hollywood film. So just all in a day's work for Gordon Parks. He was born in Fort Scott, Kansas, what he called the Mecca of bigotry. He was one of a family of 15 children and was on his own very early. His sister and her husband were helping to raise him, and I believe the sister's husband ejected him, and he was quickly on his own, doing all kinds of things to support himself. He said, from being a busboy and a railroad porter to being a brothel piano player and working for the Civilian Conservation Corps, planting trees and building campsites. He bought his first camera at age 25. And again, he was intrigued by this, was largely self-taught. And again, it's just really, really extraordinary story. And these are his words. He said, when I felt I couldn't say what was in me, I turned to photography. I learned that it would enable me to show what was right and what was wrong about America, the world, and life. And I thought, really powerful quote. In 1941, he was awarded a fellowship that allowed him to move to DC and work again with the Farm Security Administration, where we just met Marion Post Walcott. And he thought, okay, I'm going to document things here. He met Roy Stryker, who was the driving force behind that team of photographers. And he said Stryker just, first thing he did was take his camera away from him and said, well, why don't you get to know Washington, D.C.? And of course he did. And again, this is the middle of the Second World War. This is 1941. And of course, DC, a city with a very Southern orientation in many ways. Gordon Park said, I went to the motion pictures and was refused. I went to a big department store and tried to buy a coat and they wouldn't sell me one. He said they wouldn't feed me at several restaurants and I was livid. Finally, he went back to talk with Roy Stryker. Roy Stryker handed him back the camera and said, why don't you just document that? So he did. He did. One of the first things he did, Stryker sent him to meet with a Black charwoman who worked in their building, a woman named Ella Watson. And he followed her for weeks, home, church, with her family, as she tried to support her daughter and grandkids. And he posed her in a very distinctive way. Next image, which might ring a bell. In addition to following her everywhere, he posed her in this manner in the building in which they were working, of course, against the flag, with her broom and mop, very much in the style of Grant Wood's American Gothic. And Stryker, of course, was stunned and said, you're going to get us all fired, but the image exists. And so does the rest of his study of Ella Watson. So I'll give you the next image. Yeah, this is again, Ella Watson back in her apartment. And what he does, and this very much was part of his operating style at Life magazine too, he doesn't just take one photograph, but he would spend days, sometimes weeks, with a sitter or a family and really get a sense of their life. And that versatility was a huge, huge asset for him. Often he would get a spread in Life magazine, that would be a 16-page spread. So you really got a sense of delving into somebody's life. He also did everything else too. He did celebrities. So you've seen maybe his photographs of Muhammad Ali. He did fashion photography as well. And again, every kind of topic you could imagine. Life called him a visual ambassador to hidden worlds of the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed. Next image, please. This is an image called the Fontanelles at the Poverty Board, which again is in the collection of the Johnson Museum of Art. He followed this family, the Fontanelles, the father, mother, and 9 kids through every kind of difficulty you can imagine: jobless, frustrated, kids hungry, mom exhausted. And this is an image that he took again by scooting around behind the man at the Poverty Board. And again, putting us, the viewer, in the position of facing this exhausted and hungry and discouraged and despondent family, but from the position of the person granting the assistance. But again, the spread, Google this too, because the whole spread you can see online of him with his family, with the kids in their apartment, which is just crumbling to pieces, and appealing for help for the family. Some of these pieces actually got help for the subjects, and the Fontanelles, again, got some assistance from readers of Life magazine. Next image, please. Also did a huge story, again, on segregation in Birmingham, focusing on a family, and again, following them for weeks. That family pictured here was then threatened and driven from their home and had to be relocated later by Life magazine. So again, there were many, many risks in doing what he was doing, and certainly for the subjects of his work too. And one more to show you is just called Tenement Couple. And again, what's fascinating is where he was able to go and what he was able to capture. And again, by spending a lot of time with sitters, that sense of building a trust and a comfort to allow an image as intimate as this one of the, somehow I think, the heat and the frustration and the claustrophobia of a little apartment on a hot day in New York City. Next image, please. Our next photographer, again, I guarantee you, you know his work, but you probably do not know his name. And that is Charles Moore. who was a white native Southerner who was often working for Montgomery newspapers and later for Life magazine. And he was on the very front lines of the civil rights movement and readily tells us that he could go places that others could not go because of his access, again, as a white Southern man. His images were hugely influential and really altering, public opinion of the civil rights movement. Next image, I am sure you have seen images this of the peaceful, again, protesters in Birmingham being met with not just the police, but the fire department and their hoses, which were then channeling pressure by combining multiple hoses up to 100 pounds per square inch. And this was the kind of thing that changed hearts and minds. And remember, at this time, more than half of the US adult population is reading Life magazine. So to have a picture spread on something like this, again, was really to change the country in many ways. Next image, please. And again, what he was able to do was to get so close to the firefighters that he was literally behind them. Something that, again, I don't think another photographer could have done. He was so close, he was able to talk to them. He said one would later confide to him, "We're supposed to fight fire, not people." But again, it's all about the perspective and where these photographers put you, whether they're putting you behind the desk, again, of that poverty board or with the firemen who are directing these dangerous streams of water at the nonviolent protesters. Next image, please. I bet this one is one again, as well. There's an absolutely incredible documentary on YouTube about Charles Moore that tells you so much more about him and his work and how he captured many of these images. And I would definitely recommend that to you. This is, again, a famous image that was appropriated by Andy Warhol and then replicated over and over again in his silk screens, many of them focusing on the civil rights movement. Next image, please. And this, of course, is the rest of Dr. Martin Luther King. And again, look at that YouTube video because it is fascinating. Moore is following King from outside on the street, watching this arrest, snapping away. He goes in with the group, and I have no idea how he achieves this, but he actually goes in, goes through the little swinging wooden door, and gets behind the desk in the police department with the desk sergeant. So once again, the viewer is in the position of arresting, of facing Dr. King. So this is quite extraordinary. It gives us, I think, a perspective that, again, it's just extraordinary. And each one of these photographers is really thinking about where they want to put you as the viewer in these stories and these narratives. But again, I would ask you to please look a little bit more at Charles Moore because he is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to show you one more photographer today. And this is a contemporary photographer working right now named JR. And you may or may not be familiar with his work. He originally started out as a graffiti artist. And now he calls himself a photographer. So a kind of a combination of graffiti and photographer. His work is always displayed outside, does not want it in a gallery. He thinks the street, in his words, is the largest art gallery in the world. And again, what's fascinating is he's always drawn to issues of social justice and to marginalized communities and wanting you to pay attention to these communities. Next image, please. In 2007, he visited Israel and Palestine and created, I think to his delight, what he called the largest illegal photo show ever. And he traveled extensively on both sides of the wall, just again, talking to people, visiting. He said he saw so many connections and similarities. He said, I think we need to focus on some of the similarities. And again, this is a Frenchman speaking, not the differences. He said, I just really want to put people face to face. So to that end, his project was to ask dozens of people who were Jewish, people who were Muslim, people who were Christian, in all different walks of life, clergy people, teachers, and hairdressers, and restaurant owners, and asked them to pose for his camera, making a silly face. He took those portraits and just blew them up. So these are quite large, and again, put them on both sides of the wall. Next image, please. Again, this is an image that he took, a project in a California prison. Again, he so wanted to capture both the stories and the portraits of, again, incarcerated men at this prison, knew that the only way he could do it was to take the photographs and actually put it on the top, on the roof of the prison. So that's exactly what he's done here. Again, many of his other works take him all over the world, from the favelas of Brazil to Africa to, again, Middle East. And again, always focusing on people, shall we say, who do not usually get their photographs taken, and trying to enlarge them and their stories so that we will notice and we will pay attention. Got one more image to show you. And this is an image, I don't know if many of you have seen this. This is another piece by J.R. called Chiquito. And this is an installation that he did along the border wall with Mexico. And here he actually asked the mother of a toddler on the Mexican side if he could take a photograph of the child, blow it up. She agreed. And what he has done is build a scaffolding on the Mexican side of the wall and create this massive image of this toddler named Chiquito, just kind of, looking over the wall. And of course, that echoing image of the wall obviously looks very much like a crib as well. But that sense of innocence and curiosity and exploration is very much apparent in this piece. I love the comments of the mother of this toddler. She said, "It's my son and I can recognize him, but I hope for others it represents any kid, any person who has dreams, and dreams that are not alienated by any political vision or prejudice." The mother of this toddler said of this project, she said, "The artist, JR, was trying to give voice to the silent," and added, "No one looks until he makes it big." I love that quote. And I think that's so true of everyone we've looked at today. No one looks until those photographers made it big, focused and captured an image, whether it was Lewis Hine and child labor, or Charles Moore and civil rights demonstrators, or JR and incarcerated men. No one looks until these photographers focus their energy and their effort on these communities, and it begins to be seen and noticed and talked about. So I thank you. I think that's our last image. Oh, I think. Yep, just the credits. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have today. And